Hello, test, test. 1 2 3 1 2 3. Let's see if we can get this live stream up. Let's see. All right, audio is good. All right. Let's see. All right, welcome everyone. Anyone who shows up, at least, to this year's series of live streams on our compendium. And so today is the first live stream. We're going to be live streaming every day for 26 days straight. And every day we're going to cover a different chapter of our compendium, which you can follow on our website. I had added a link to this page on the description of the live stream. And so every single chapter of our compendium covers a section of history. So everything's chronological. And today we cover the first chapter, which we call La Conquista, from 1492 until 1603. And we have 26 chapters total. And each chapter, or group of chapters, are grouped into eras. So the first era, the colonial era, has the first 3 chapters. And today we're just going to be covering the first one. And so each chapter has its own page, similar to this, on our website. And each chapter is further divided into sections. And each section will have its own timeline, like what you see here. And so this chapter, La Conquista, has 3 sections. The first section is called Conquistadors of the Caribbean, from 1492 to 1516. The next section is called the Tierra Firme, 1516 to 1558. And then the third section is the Elizabethan Age, from 1558 to 1603. As I said before, each section has its own interactive timeline, like what you see here. And the material that's on the timeline is what we're going to be covering today and every live stream, where it's mostly just primary source documents and events. For the colonial era, we mostly have events on here. We will be adding more primary source documents in the future. And the reason why I want to do these live streams every year is to show you our progression. So last year I did these live streams, and it was our website looked very different last year. We only had one timeline for each chapter, so everything was kind of smushed together within the chapter. But I added so much stuff that it became too dense, and so I took the one timeline and then divided up into sectional timelines, like what you see here. And so we can just go right into the actual material that we include in our chapter 1 timelines. So we begin with the Conquistadors of the Caribbean, our first section, and this begins in 1492. Now, what happens in 1492 is very important events that happen in especially Iberia, and that the biggest event to happen is the end of the Reconquista. The Reconquista is about a 700, almost 800 year conflict between the people of Iberia, mostly modern day Spain and Portugal, versus the Arabic Muslim invaders of the peninsula of Iberia. And it took the Christians almost 800 years to finally kick out the Muslims from Iberia, and the very last city, the Muslim city stronghold to fell in January 2nd of 1492, where Muhammad XII, the Nasrid ruler of Granada, handed over the city of Granada. So that's this guy here. He hands over Granada which is in southern modern-day Spain. Spain wasn't a country back then. It was controlled by two main regions called Castile and Aragon, and the two monarchs of those two regions, Ferdinand and Isabella, will be married. They'll unite the Spanish country together, and they will succeed in ending the Reconquista. When the Reconquista ends, the Spanish are able to look beyond Iberia. And that's exactly what they do with Christopher Columbus. And so we have a couple of documents like the capitulations of Santa Fe and the privileges granted to Columbus by the Spanish monarchy on giving Christopher Columbus a charter, titles like Admiral of the Ocean is one of the titles that Columbus has, and the charter to start a colony somewhere west of Europe and Africa. Whatever lands, non-Christian lands that Christopher Columbus can find will be claimed by Columbus for the Spanish monarchy. And so these documents are charters for Columbus. Columbus will go on his first voyage, which begins in August of 1492. So things are moving pretty quickly from the end of the Reconquista till the start of the first voyage happens within half a year. And so Christopher Columbus, he goes on his first voyage, which lasts almost a year, half a year, and he lands on the island of Hispaniola, which is where he will found a number of smaller cities, like La Navidad is probably the first. It was a short-lived settlement, but it was the first settlement that Christopher Columbus made. And the primary sources that we have for this is a diary that Christopher Columbus had. And on the timeline, like I said before, we have primary source documents for each of these events on the timeline that you see. If you see this read document button, that means we have a primary source, which is, the actual source of this event. And so for here, we have the diary of Christopher Columbus. The original manuscript was lost, but it was copied by a friar named Bartolome de las Casas, and he will become a very important friar. And he wasn't a political leader; he was a religious leader, but he will have a major impact on politics later in this chapter. And so it's interesting to see that he's the one who actually transcribed the original manuscript. And so we only know about the diary of Christopher Columbus because of Bartolome de las Casas. It is on October 12th, according to the diary, that Christopher Columbus makes landfall. And again, he lands somewhere in the Bahamas. We believe it is the island of San Salvador. We don't know exactly sure. The maps back then weren't really kept, but we can have educated guesses on where exactly he landed. And every single exploration, not just of Christopher Columbus, but all of the conquistadors, Christopher Columbus being the first conquistador, will write these letters or reports back to the Spanish monarchy, talking about where they went, what they saw, what they did, and what they're bringing back, and usually wealth, in order to inspire more investment from the Spanish monarchy, but from other investors as well. And so we actually have Christopher Columbus's letter of his first voyage. This is basically a voyage report of Columbus to the Spanish monarchy, which is a very, very nice primary source document. And a lot of people cite this document too. The papal bull of Inter Caetera, I know I'm saying that wrong, is issued by Pope Alexander VI, who is actually a Borgia. His real name is Rodrigo de Borgia. And this is the dividing line between what the Spanish can colonize and what the Portuguese can colonize. People wrongfully believe that that's the Treaty of Tordesillas. That's not the Treaty of Tordesillas. The Treaty of Tordesillas, which we have, is a later document by just 1 year, and that was negotiated by the Spanish and the Portuguese separate from the Pope. So the Pope did not issue the Treaty of Tordesillas. The Pope issued a papal bull in Terra Caetera, which creates that dividing line, but the Portuguese, under John the First or something like that, will complain about the exact line on the map. He wants it to be a little bit further to the west, and so the Portuguese and Spanish will, a year later, create the Treaty of Tordesillas, which just moves the dividing line west by a couple hundred miles, so that the Portuguese have more land that they can colonize in the New World. So, common misconception. The Pope did not create the Treaty of Tordesillas. The Pope created this document, the Inter Caetera, which will later be replaced by the Treaty of Tordesillas. And it's interesting, we try to find the actual documents, the primary source documents. If we can find an image of those documents, like what you see here, then we try to do that as well. It makes the text look or feel more real if you can have an actual image of the text, like this is real handwriting from 500 plus years ago now, and so it's better to see the image and not just the text or the transcription of it. On the timeline, we don't just have primary source documents, we also have events, and we try to keep track of important political leaders during this time period. Like during the colonial era, knowing who is the Pope is important, knowing who is a Holy Roman Emperor becomes important, especially in the next section in this chapter. And so we keep track of the different monarchs, the Pope, the Holy Roman Emperor, who's king of England, who is king of Spain, who is king of France. Those are the main offices that we try to keep track of, since they have a major impact on the colonization of the Americas. And so this guy, the son of Frederick III and part of the Habsburg family, Maximilian, becomes the Holy Roman Emperor. During this time, you have Christopher Columbus's second voyage, which is much longer than the first, and he is able to establish long-lasting settlements like La Isabela on Hispaniola, and that's still a real populated city today. And in, I think, Haiti nowadays. And again, we have this document, which is not from Christopher Columbus himself, but from a fellow conquistador who was on this voyage. He wrote about it in a separate report. You have the conquest of Hispaniola, which happens sometime at the start of 1494, during the second voyage of Christopher Columbus. And this is a over-exaggerated depiction. This is by Theodore de Bry, and this engraving was made in 1552 for a book that Bartolomé de las Casas writes, A Brief History on the Destruction of the Indies, of the Americas. And even Bartolomé de las Casas thinks that these depictions were a little too much. So this is not an accurate depiction of the events, but it is accurate enough, which is, just looking at the description of the Spanish conquest is very concerning. So we are rated R. If we were a movie, we'd be rated R because we include a lot of pretty nasty things on this timeline. Here's the Treaty of Tordesillas that I mentioned earlier. Again, the Pope did not issue the Treaty of Tordesillas. He issued the Inter Caetera. The Treaty of Tordesillas replaces the Inter Caetera, and it was negotiated only by the Portuguese and the Spanish to move the longitudinal boundary line couple hundred miles west of what the Pope had issued. It is during the second voyage that Christopher Columbus will proclaim that he discovered Cathay, which is China, and he obviously did not discover China. He will die believing that he landed somewhere in East Asia, whether that be near China or in the Philippines or in Japan. We don't know what his final thoughts were, but we know for a fact that he landed in Cuba, not China. During this time, the Spanish are not the only ones interested in exploring the New World, and one of the earliest competitors to the Spanish explorations is actually the English. Henry VII, if you know your English history, Henry VII is the guy who defeated Richard III and ended the War of the Roses and establishes the Tudor dynasty. And so this is the same Henry VII who gives a charter or a patent to John Cabot. John Cabot is not actually an English guy. He is an Italian, like Christopher Columbus. I think he's from Genoa, and his last name's like Cabata or something like that. And so, even though this is a patent by an English king, it's actually explored by an Italian. So Italians are really known at this time for their navigational skills, thanks to the Mediterranean trade, as opposed to other navigators of this time period. It is during the second voyage of Christopher Columbus that he sets up these settlements, and he begins to rule the settlements like a dictator. He is not a nice person, even not just to the Native Americans who are being killed mostly from disease, but also by the effects of conquest, mass starvation, and stuff like that. Even some of his fellow Spaniards actually rebel against not just Columbus, but his brothers, who come along with Columbus in his second voyage. So that's why there's plural Columbuses in this. And eventually, Christopher Columbus will be arrested. And we'll cover that later in this section. We have John Cabot's first voyage. He will land further north of the Spanish. So the Spanish and Portuguese are landing around Central and South America, while the English will begin landing and exploring the North American, trying to find a passage all the way to Asia. Of course, there's a giant continent in the way, but they didn't know that at this time. And on June 24th, 1497 is when John Cabot makes landfall on what we think is Newfoundland. We don't know exactly where on Newfoundland, but we believe that was the island that he landed, which is very close to where the Vikings had landed in Vineland, hundreds and hundreds of years prior to this time period. It is also pretty early on, within a couple years, that the Spanish will start to create policies for settling and cultivating the American colonies. So the first few years, first 5 or so years, are mostly about exploring, trying to find out what is over here in the New World. Now that the Spanish have set up a couple settlements, mostly in the Caribbean, the Spanish monarchs are now trying to organize the colonies themselves with decrees like this one. Here is John Cabot's second patent. And then Christopher Columbus's third voyage, which lasts a couple of years, from 1498 to 1500. Here is Pedro Nino. He will be an explorer, and he has a very short voyage, very cheap voyage, but a highly rewarding voyage. He makes a ton of money, and it's Pedro Nino's voyage that comes back wealthy with a bunch of pearls from what we believe is the coast of modern day Colombia, and he will return in Venezuela, and he will return to um, Spain with a bunch of riches, mostly pearls, that he traded. So it wasn't a violent one. He didn't establish any colonies. He just went there, traded, and made a huge profit. And this encourages a huge investment of more voyages like this one, more exploration, searching for riches. So Christopher Columbus, he's out there trying to find the Chinese authorities to trade with, but Pedro Nino is the first one to actually trade with the Native Americans and make a lot of money from that. Here is Amerigo Vespucci. He's another Italian guy who is working with, at this time, with Spain. He will eventually switch to working with the Portuguese. And so, what I like about this map, made by World History Encyclopedia, designed by Simeon Nechev, this is a map of the world according to what people believed, on top of the map of the actual world. And so you can see what people were trying to reach was places like Japan and China, but of course they're far off course, and they land in the New World. And Amerigo Vespucci is one of those who will argue that this land over here is not the same as this land, which obviously makes sense looking at the map. But again, people like Christopher Columbus will refuse to believe that. He will believe that he actually landed in Asia all the way up until he dies. And so Amerigo Vespucci is the first guy to argue, or at least the first major explorer who actually went there to argue that this is a whole new world. And that's where we get the term New World, is from Amerigo Vespucci. And you'll see why in a short while when we get to the main book that he writes. And another important thing about the Amerigo Vespucci voyage is he sails with Alonso de Ojeda, who will be a very important conquistador later on. And so when you look at the timeline of all these voyages, you see that very important conquistadors like Cortez and a bunch of others, Ponce de Leon, they are starting out as just members of previous voyages before they get to have their own voyages and their own conquests. Bobadilla is sent by the Spanish monarchy to investigate the reign of Columbus. So reports like Roldan's rebels reach the Spanish monarchs. They're very concerned, and they send this guy, Francisco de Bobadilla, to investigate the mounting complaints of the administration of Christopher Columbus. And he will replace Christopher Columbus as governor of Hispaniola while Columbus is arrested and is sent back to Spain to stand trial. So you can see here, sometime in October 1500, Christopher and Diego Columbus are arrested by Bobadilla and sent to Spain. It is while Christopher Columbus is arrested that he writes his third voyage, and this will be almost like an excuse or a justification for his administration, that he will send ahead of him back to Spain for the monarchs to read, and it is in part this letter that gets Columbus off on any charges. And like I said before, many of the important conquistadors will start to have their own voyages of exploration and later conquest. and they start out with these small explorations, and then it gets bigger into a larger conquest. So we see that, it's not like some random Spaniard goes to the New World and conquers. Like, no, these people are building up experience, knowing what the region is like, knowing the native peoples, and then they go out and conquer. So it's more methodical than just randomly going on a unplanned exploration and conquest. Like, no, these people are building up their experience before the conquests. Columbus is released sometime in December of 1500. Here's Amerigo Vespucci's second voyage that he makes, and this is this time for the Portuguese. Ovando, someone who was in the previous exploration, I believe the second exploration of Christopher Columbus, and the third one as well, and he will replace Bobadilla as governor of Hispaniola in order to restore order, because Bobadilla himself was not really a good administrator as well as Columbus. And here's a document from the Spanish monarchy called a Real Credula, which means royal order, for exporting African slaves to the Americas. In the first few years, the Spanish will use Native American slaves, but because of disease and starvation and murder, many of the Native Americans are killed at this point, especially those in the Caribbean, the Taino people, and there's very few of them left at this point. It's not even been 10 years, and an entire civilization of Taino people are almost completely wiped out. And so they have to replace the laborers with other people. And this is a early document from the Spanish monarchy allowing the Africans that are enslaved to be sold and brought to the New World, specifically Hispaniola. And so people like to talk about the 1619 project. Well, the first African slaves brought over here was ordered sometime around 1500, so 1501. We have this document. It might take a few months later for the actual first slaves to be brought over from Africa. So it's not quite 1619. It's over 100 years before 1619. It's around 1501. Christopher Columbus begins preparation for his fourth voyage after being exonerated, also in 1501. Ovando departs Spain with a massive fleet of 30 ships and 2,000 settlers. This is the largest expedition yet to the Americas. And so Ovando will become a very important conquistador and administrator of the colonies, especially Hispaniola. And then you have the fourth voyage of Christopher Columbus, which is from 1502 to 1504. And this one, he goes, let's see, around. This purple is the fourth voyage, so he comes in further south than the first two, and he makes his way all the way to Jamaica, and then all the way to what would become Central America. This is where the Mayans are, and then he'll go down this coast of modern-day Panama and Costa Rica, all the way back up to around Jamaica. And I believe he does return to Spain, and then he'll die in Spain. So the fourth voyage is the final voyage of Christopher Columbus. And in this one, he reaches the mainland, what the Spanish will call the Tierra Firme of the New World. Again, he's still believing that he's in Asia. He is not in Asia. He is in the New World. Ovando, very important conquistador, arrives to Hispaniola to begin his governorship of the region, and he will reassert direct royal authority, as opposed to the more proprietary style of Christopher Columbus. And this is the early steps towards indigenous labor allocation into reducciones, or reductions, which will become, during the section, it will become known as the encomienda system. So reducciones means reduction, and that is to reduce the area that the natives are living in. So say you have this island, and there's 100 different villages on this island, and you're trying to organize labor, but it's all spread out. What the reducciones and the encomienda system are going to do is they're going to pretty much capture all of these villagers and all of these villages and bring them into a single settlement called the encomienda, or the reducciones. And so they're reducing the area that the natives are living in, almost like a reservation, and they will organize these new communities by force and also by religion. So you're going to have a church that's going to be the center of the reducciones communities. That way it's easier for the indoctrination of Catholic teaching. It's done easier if you have a single large community as opposed to 100 desperate or distant villages all over the island. So this is the start of the institution of the encomienda through creating communities like the reducciones. And it's not just a religious thing, they're also organizing labor in order to extract wealth from the islands. And so Bobadilla, the guy who arrests Christopher Columbus, and Roldan, the guy who rebels against Christopher Columbus, both of them on their way back to Spain will actually die in a hurricane, and most of the treasure fleet will sink, except, ironically, for most of Columbus's own money. And so, he has a share of the wealth, and his share doesn't sink, which is kind of funny. Some people, contemporary people, will be like, "Oh, Christopher Columbus put a spell or a curse on his enemies." No, it was just a coincidence of a hurricane. This is during Christopher Columbus's fourth voyage. He lands in modern-day Honduras, as you saw on the map. And sometime in 1503 is when Amerigo Vespucci will publish the Mundus Novus. Mundus Novus means new world. Novus means new. Mundus means globe or world. And so this is the first document arguing, at least that we know of, the first publication by an explorer like Amerigo Vespucci, arguing that the New World is actually a new world. It's a separate continent from Asia. It's not China, it's not Japan, it's not the Philippines, it's not India. It's a whole new world that the Europeans never knew about. Barring some Vikings that visited, Vineland and Newfoundland almost 1,000 years before. But other than the Vikings, Europeans did not know about this place. And so again, for each of these primary source documents, you can read the full text. So we actually have the full book of Mundus Novus that you can read here on our website. And now we get to the institutions of colonialism. So a lot of people talk about institutional racism or settler colonialism or terms like this without going into the details of what specific policies, what specific institutions, who were the administrators of those institutions, what did they actually do, what impact did they actually have on the people. Most people who talk about institutionalization or institutions don't really go into the details. We go to the details, and so we have a bunch of these primary sources from mostly, at this time, the Spanish monarchs who are establishing what would become known as the encomienda system, which, as I explained before, there's two main reasons for the encomienda: is to organize labor, to extract wealth, but it's also to educate Native Americans in Catholicism. And so the Reducciones, those communities will force natives together so that they can be better organized when it comes to organizing the labor, but also it's easier to teach one community Catholicism as opposed to having hundreds of other separate communities and trying to teach them all the same thing. So the encomienda system is being established around 1503 with some of these documents. And this is the first instance of the reductionis being implemented. And so it is against the, and I'm going to butcher this name, Zaragua chiefdom, which is on Hispaniola. They're the indigenous Tiano rulers of Hispaniola. And after this conquest, which is led by the new governor Ovando, they will establish the first reducciones, or reduction, of Hispaniola. So a lot of the Tiano people are now dead because of that. And then here's an actual letter from Isabella, Queen of Spain, to Ovando on establishing the encomienda, on how she wants the actual, reducciones to be implemented in practice. So it's a longer process. It's not like a single document creates these institutions. It's very like testing out the waters, like trying to see like what works and what doesn't work, like troubleshooting the problem and trying to find a solution. And so we have letters back and forth between Isabella and Ovando about, what's the best way to actually implement the encomienda system. And this leads to a second campaign. And this one, it was under the authority of Ovando, but it was actually implemented by Ponce de Leon, which we all know is the discoverer of Florida. But before then, he was actually, before he discovered Florida, he was working under Ovando to implement the encomienda system. It is around this time, 1504, that Isabella of Castile dies, and she was the Queen of Spain. Spain isn't exactly a single country yet. It's not a fully united country. It's still divided between Aragon and Castile, but their grandchildren, or their grandchild, who will become Charles I of Spain, will unite, Castile and Aragon, since he's the product of both, kingdoms. And so Spain is being born at the same time that the American colonies, or the Spanish colonies in the Americas, is being established. And so Ferdinand, he will marry a French princess named Germaine of Fox. French, I don't know why half their language is silent. And this will help unite the interests of the Spanish and the French. And also at this time, on May 20th, 1506, Christopher Columbus himself dies. Again, he dies believing that he landed in Asia as opposed to the New World. A year later, you have this, I think should be more famous, map of the world in 1507. So this map, which I forget which archive, it's in America. It might be the Metropolitan Museum. I'm going to have to look up exactly where this map is right now. But this map was made by a German cartographer named Martin Vollensimers, and it's this map where you see this guy right here. This is Americi Vespuccio. Now, the Latin and feminized version of Amerigo, which is his Italian first name, is America. And so Americo is the origin of the name America, and it's because of this map by a German guy um, that popularized calling the new land, specifically South America and the Caribbean, America. And so it's interesting that the American name was popularized by a German guy who made a map about an Italian guy who founded the New World for the Spanish and Portuguese. So it's very cosmopolitan, very European esque for all these different connections and countries to be cooperating in this kind of way. But you can see this is what people thought the world looked like. And honestly, the map of the New World looks a lot more accurate than what they thought was going on in Asia. Like, most of this stuff doesn't actually exist. It didn't exist back then. This is not like an Atlantis kind of situation where all these islands disappeared. No, most of this stuff is just bad cartography by Europeans at this time. And so Americo Vespucci gets a promotion. Maybe it's a coincidence that the promotion happens shortly after the publication of this map. Who knows? But he gets promoted by the Spanish, and he becomes their chief navigator for the main office of organizing explorations into the New World. It is in 1508 at Ponce de Leon. He begins to do his own exploration, and he finds places like Puerto Rico. And so it is not just Florida that people know about, but he also claims Puerto Rico for the Spanish. Henry VII, the guy who founded the Tudor dynasty, he dies in April of 1509, and this is when Henry VIII becomes King of England. And so it's interesting that we have this, picture of Henry when he was like 8 during this time. And so he becomes king pretty early on in his life. And let's see, the conquest of Jamaica happens in 1509. Henry VIII marries Catherine of Aragon. And so this is the daughter of King Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, one of their daughters. They have another daughter. They have a few children. And so this unites the interests of the Spanish and the English. And so the Spanish and the French are united because Ferdinand is now married to a French princess after the death of Queen Isabella, and now the Spanish have a connection with the English because Catherine is now married to Henry VIII. This is the first of 6 wives of Henry VIII. Here's another royal order for expanding the slave trade in the Americas. And so again, it's not 1619, it's more like 1601 or 1501, over 100 years before the 1619 thing. And we'll cover the 1619 thing tomorrow in chapter 2. Now you have the conquest of Cuba, which happens or is led by Diego Velázquez de Cuellar. I'm sorry for butchering all these names. And so the Spanish are now establishing a stronghold on the largest island in the Caribbean, Cuba. Now, Montesino, he is a friar. He is the mentor to Bartolome de las Casas, and he will be one of the very first Catholic priests to advocate in favor of the rights and liberties of the Native American people. And so he's the first guy. He actually gets killed by some conquistadors who don't like what he was saying about what they were doing. But Montesino is very influential in convincing the Spanish monarchy to start limiting the excesses and abuses by the conquistadors. And so you'll see the laws of Burgos and the requirimiento, which we'll talk about very shortly. In fact, we'll talk about it right now. And so the laws of Burgos was really restrictions on what the living conditions, the labor obligations, and religious instruction of not only the indigenous peoples in the Americas, but also limit what the conquistadors can do and how the conquistadors, the Spanish, can treat the Native Americans. And so it's not all like all the Spanish were wanting to abuse all Native Americans. No, there are many Spaniards, including the monarchs, who were very conscious of the religious and moral side of the conquest of the Americas. Of course, they're more than willing to turn a blind eye whenever they get paid, but at least they're showing some interest in the treatment of Native Americans and wanting to treat Native Americans relatively well, relative compared to what the conquistadors wanted to do, which is just abuse the Native Americans 24/7. And so this is going to lead towards conflict between the conquistadors and the heirs of the encomienda system and the Spanish authorities in the next section. The requirimiento, again, I'm butchering these words, but the requirimiento is a requirement, that's what the word means, of the conquistadors to have a priest read out to the Native Americans. It's almost like an origin, maybe not in a direct origin, but it's similar to like the Miranda rights that we have. Like when a cop arrests us, they have to read out the Miranda rights while or before they arrest us. Before the conquistadors can conquer a native people, they have to have a priest say this very long scripted text about, you know, the Native Americans can surrender and convert to Catholicism and submit to Spanish authority, or they can be captured by force. So it's a religious requirement on the part of the conquistadors having to read certain text before they can conquer. Ugh. Excuse me. And so we have the famous Ponce de Leon Florida expedition, which happens in 1513. So he leaves Puerto Rico and he finds Florida, just north of Cuba. On April 2nd, 1513, he will claim Florida for Spain. And the laws of Burgos, what I just mentioned, will be amended. It's called the Valladolid Amendments, which will just be a revision of the laws of Burgos. Vasco Nunez will have his own expedition. Again, a lot of these conquistadors and explorers, they start out as just a helper or a member of a previous expedition. And then if that becomes successful, if they survive it, then they can have their own expedition as well. And so Balboa, he was in multiple previous expeditions. Now he has his own, and he goes across the Isthmus of Panama, and he will actually see the Pacific Ocean. And so here's an 18th century engraving of that event. Here's Nunez going into the Pacific Ocean. So that happened on September 25th, 1513. It is also during this time that an Italian guy, Niccolò Machiavelli, he will write a letter to a prince, Prince Medici, Lorenzo de' Medici, and that letter will, after he dies, posthumously be published as The Prince, which is a very influential book, and it's one of my favorite books, especially during this time period, and I encourage people to read. And again, every primary source document that we have a button called Read Document that you can read the full text of yourself if you're interested in doing that. Ponce de Leon is appointed the Adelantado of Florida, which is just the Spanish term for governor. And then here is a papal bull, the Sacrosanctus Salvatoris et Redemptoris Nostri. I know I butchered that Latin. And this is going to be the start, or at least the inciting incident for the Protestant Reformation. So all of the indulgences that Martin Luther complained about in the corruption, this is the papal bull that created those specific indulgences, and those indulgences were issued out, funnily enough, in order to raise money to pay for St. Peter's Basilica. So that famous building in the Vatican is the reason why the Protestant Reformation happened. At least, one of the dominoes for the Protestant Reformation, which I think is kind of funny. That basically a fundraising campaign for the Basilica led to the Protestant Reformation. And then you have a letter. Again, a lot of the primary source documents for the explorers and conquistadors are reports back to the monarchs, talking about where they went, what they saw, what they did. And for this one, this is the primary source for Balboa's voyage across the Isthmus of Panama and seeing the Pacific Ocean for the first time. And then the very last event that we have on this timeline is the death of King Ferdinand of Aragon. And so he really begins this section. Him and his wife Isabella of Castile, they begin this section with the conquest, the end of the Reconquista, and the beginning of the La Conquista of the New World. And so this is the last event of this section, the first section of the chapter. We are almost 1 hour in, and we've only gone through one section, and this is the smallest section of this chapter. The other two timelines, as you can see, have a lot more stuff and are almost twice as long each than the section that we just covered. So we're probably going to be here for a couple more hours. So let's go right into the next section. This section is called the Terra Firme. And the very first event that begins the section is the coronation of Charles I, the ascension of Charles I as King of Spain. So he's actually the grandchild of Ferdinand and Isabella, and he is a Habsburg. He is the first Habsburg on the Spanish throne. And so he's also the one to finally have a united Spain. And so he's a very important monarch during this time period. He will also, at the same time as being Charles I of Spain, he will become Holy Roman Emperor, and he'll be given the name Charles V. So he's both Charles I of Spain and Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire, and he will be the instrumental defender of the Catholic faith during the Protestant Reformation and during the Counter-Reformation, which is a very violent time, and that all that happens within this guy's reign. And so he dies at the end of this section. He dies pretty much the same time as Queen Mary I of England. And so this entire section basically just covers the reign of Charles I of Spain. Not Charles I of England. That happens 100 years later. This is Charles I of Spain. Here is a document called Utopia, or Utopiae Insulae, from Thomas More. It is an interesting philosophical and theological writing. It's fiction by Thomas More, who is a religious figure in England, and he becomes important during the not the Protestant Reformation, which is mostly in modern-day Germany, but for the English Reformation, if you can call it that, under Henry VIII. So Henry VIII is monarch at this time, by the way. And so you have the very first expedition to explore and to start to settle the terra firma, which is the mainland of the Americas. This is modern day Central and South America. Happens at this time around 1517. It's also 1517 when Martin Luther posts his 95 Theses and begins the Protestant Reformation. So all this is happening at the same time, which is kind of crazy to think about. Here's another expedition to the Yucatan by Hernan Cortez. Luther examined at the Diet of Augsburg. This is Martin Luther. He is being questioned for his 95 Theses. Hernan Cortez, will sail to the Yucatan, and this will be the start of his conquest of the Aztecs in modern-day southern Mexico. Here's another expedition to the Gulf of Mexico in search of a passage to the Pacific Ocean. Right now, they only know about the Isthmus of Panama, but the Panama Canal was not made, and so they're trying to find a water path to the Pacific Ocean. Luther debates Johann Eck at the Leipzig debate. Again, this is part of the Protestant Reformation. And then Magellan will do his circumnavigation of the world from 1519 to 1522. He will actually not survive this. So Magellan is not the first guy to have circumnavigated the globe. In fact, it would be, I believe he's a slave or some kind of indentured servant who was on this voyage. He was from the Asian Pacific. He was brought to Spain, and then he went on the voyage. So this guy would be the first human being on record to have circumnavigated the whole globe. Now, the Spanish guy who circumnavigated the globe is Elcano. He's the one who will survive from Spain going all the way around to back to Spain. He circumnavigates the world. Magellan dies, Elcano survives. This is when Charles I becomes elected the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, replacing Maximilian I, the guy from the first section that I mentioned. This is one of the first conflicts, not the very first one. The very first one will be Roldan versus Columbus, but now you have Cortez versus Velasquez, and this is when Cortez goes off reservation and he will do his own conquest of the Aztecs, pretty much by himself, without Spanish support. And so Cortez will have to raise allies, native allies, who hate the Aztecs in order to conquer the Aztecs. And so this is a excommunication of Martin Luther, which happens in 1520, or at least he threatens excommunication of Martin Luther. And again, this is part of the Protestant Reformation that's going on. La Noche Triste, which is the Night of 30 or something like that, where Cortez is defeated by a Aztec force, and he is driven out of Tenochtitlan, which is modern-day Mexico City. Cortez has a victory against the Aztecs. Cortez will send a letter, basically asking for permission after the fact for the conquest of the Aztecs, because again, Cortez is operating outside of any legal authority when he lands in modern-day Mexico on the terra firma, and so he sends this letter, which is a report to the King Charles I of Spain, in order to get permission after the fact to do this voyage. Luther burns the papal bull that was issued. That was this one, and this will lead to his excommunication. Cortez will capture Texcoco, which is a major victory for the Spanish against the Aztecs. This is when Luther is finally excommunicated in 1521, and then Martin Luther will refuse to recant before Charles V. So Charles I, which is Charles V, is present for this. So while Charles I is responsible for, the conquest of the Americas, he's also participating in what would become the Protestant Reformation. Cortez will seize Tenochtitlan sometime in August of 1521, while the Edict of Worms is happening at the same time. So again, all this stuff, all this history that's being made is happening at the same time. Cortez becomes the governor of what would become New Spain. Here is an account of the Magellan expedition. So this is a primary source, although it wasn't written by Magellan because he died during the expedition, during the circumnavigation. Now that the Aztecs are conquered, this will lead to another expedition by Alvarado, and he will be the one to conquer the Mayans, or at least most of the Mayan civilization. The Mayans will last for many decades later, but the hegemony of the Mayans will be defeated by Pedro Alvarado. Then here is Verrazano's first voyage to the New World. He will become an important conquistador as well, but this is for the French. And so, again, Pedro de Alvarado, he will launch his campaign against the Maya in 1524. So Cortez conquers the Aztecs, Alvarado will conquer the Mayan. And that happens pretty quick. Again, not all the Mayans are conquered, but their capital cities and all their population centers are captured by the Spanish in a very short period of time. And so the Mayan society, or the Mayan hegemony in the region, will disappear by the Spanish, by Alvarado, even though the Mayan people will retreat to the Patan mountain range and continue a very long, like a century-long guerrilla war against the Spanish. So the Mayan are not completely defeated, but their power is pretty much completely gone. Here's the primary source for Verrazano for the French. So prior to this, it's mostly the Spanish and Portuguese exploring, with some English, like with John Cabot. And now you have the French beginning to explore the New World as well. Here's another institution that the Spanish will create called the Council of the Indies, which will be, the headquarters is going to be in, I don't think it's Madrid, it might be Madrid. It's somewhere in central or southern Spain. I'm thinking like Granada or Valladolid, but it might be Madrid, where the main office building that's still there of the Council of the Indies. Here is Alvarado leading the conquest of, again, I'm going to butcher these names, Zakulu, and he will defeat the Mayan in modern-day Guatemala. Francisco Pizarro makes the first contact with the Inca, and so, again, it's like one right after the other. Cortez he takes the Aztecs on, and then as soon as the Aztecs are defeated in 1522, you have Alvarado. He begins his conquest of the Maya, and then right when the Mayan are defeated in 1526, you have the start of Pizarro. He will be the one to conquer the Inca as well. So the three largest Native American empires, the Aztecs, the Maya, and the Inca, are all conquered in this red section, which is just, was it 17 years? So in just 17 years, the three largest Native American empires are conquered. So the Spanish were moving pretty quickly. And here's an interesting little voyage called Narvaez's failed expedition. Narvaez himself will die somewhere around Galveston, Texas, modern-day Galveston, Texas, and someone else in his expedition will continue the expedition, but not in the way that you think. He basically becomes a slave to various Native American tribes, and eventually makes his way all around here, all the way to Mexico City in New Spain, and so that will be the Cabeza de Vaca Odyssey. So from here all the way to here is Cabeza de Vaca. He survives, and he will write about his expedition. And now we talk about another institution. So we have the Requirimiento, we have the Reducciones, we have the Encomienda, we have a number of other institutions, the governorships, and now we have the Audiencia of Mexico. This is the first Audiencia established in the New World, and the Audiencia is a court. So most of what's established before is more executive and legislative. Now you have a judicial establishment, a judicial institution, which is the Audiencia institution, the system. So you have all these different institutions being created in order to continue the colonization of the New World and to secure and stabilize the colonies for the Spanish. And so, again, a lot of people talk about institutions without going into the details. Well, what we're trying to do is go into the details of these institutions. What were the institutions? When were they made? What did they do? How did they contribute to the colonial project? And what impact did it have on the colonists and Native Americans themselves? So we're trying to go into the nitty-gritty of all the details. And it's during this time that you have the King's Matter, which was a trial of Queen Catherine of Aragon, who is married to Henry VIII. Henry VIII famously... Henry VIII famously has 6 wives, and Catherine is the first, and Henry VIII decides to divorce Catherine and remarry, because at this point they've been married for over 20 years and she has not produced a male heir. She has produced a female heir, and she is named Mary and will become Mary the First of England. But Henry VIII, being the kind of guy that he is, he wants a male heir, and so he will divorce Catherine after this. You have the capitulation of Toledo granted to Charles the First, which formally recognized Charles the First of Spain as the heir to the Spanish crown, securing support from the Castilians, and also the Aragons. And so this is will strengthen the heir of Charles I, which would be his grandson, Ferdinand II, Ferdinand II was the grandfather of Charles I. And so this is the combining of the two kingdoms, Aragon and Castile. So Spain itself is still not yet a single unifying force until this time. Then you have the Augsburg Confession. And so this is during the Protestant Reformation. This defines Lutheran theology and established Protestantism as a coherent confessional alternative to Catholicism. And so before, Protestants were just protesting the actions of the Catholic Church, things like the indulgences and a few other things, 95 things, as Martin Luther nails on the door. And now Lutheranism is now being created as its own alternative to Catholicism. And so this is the start of Pizarro's campaign to conquer the Inca in the Andes. I'm not even going to try to pronounce that. Lutheran princes and cities form a defensive military alliance. This is when the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation, becomes militarized, and fighting will break out between the Lutherans and the Catholics in the Counter-Reformation, the early Counter-Reformation, during Charles I's reign. It is during this time that The Prince, which at first was a letter written by Niccolo Machiavelli, is now published as a book. This is posthumously published, which is 5 years after his death. And so now this book is in the public. People are reading it, and this book and a few other books will lead to the Catholic Church to begin the practice of banning authors. So not just individual books, but complete works by an individual author will be banned. And this is part of the counter-reformation of the Catholics. They're trying to ban things that they claim is a threat to Catholic hegemony and moral supremacy. Because in The Prince, Niccolo Machiavelli is arguing that leaders, princes, should rule without thinking too much about theology or morality, but to do what's effective. So that obviously scares the Catholics who want to have control over morality and control over the princely states of Europe. And you can't do that when all the princes are ignoring religion and morality in order to be as ruthless and effective rulers as possible. And then the very famous event of the Requirimiento being read out to the Inca Empire. The Inca leader will, the Inca Emperor, which is Atalupa, he will actually convert to Catholicism, but he'll be executed anyway by the Spanish. So the conquistadors are not really respecting the rule of law that was established by the laws of Burgos, by the Valladolid Amendments, and then by the Requirimiento as well. So this is the Emperor of the Inca being captured. It is, again, during the same time Henry VIII marries a second wife. So again, all this history stuff is happening at the same time. And so it's not like one thing happens and then it's separate from everything else. Like there's overlapping historical movements happening. And so this timeline kind of shows all these different movements happening at the same time. You have the Protestant Reformation in Germany. You have whatever the hell Henry VIII is going through, a midlife crisis. And then you have the conquest of the Americas as well. And so this is the primary source document of Henry VIII divorcing his first wife, and you can see he actually marries the second wife before he officially divorces his first wife. So even that was controversial. And then here's the execution of the Inca emperor Atalupa, and this is despite the fact that he converted to Catholicism, and the Spanish will enter Cuzco, which is the capital of the Inca. So again, this red section of the timeline, which is only 17 years of history, includes the start of the Protestant Reformation, the start of reign Charles I, the conquest of the Aztecs by Cortez, the conquest of the Maya by Alvarado, and the conquest of the Inca by Pizarro. And so all that history is happening in this very short, less than 2 decades of history, which is very fascinating to me to have, once you put everything on a timeline, to see like just how fast things were moving back then. You have the first Anabaptist kingdom of Munster being established. I'm not really a theologian. I only put these events to give context to what was going on for the Protestant Reformation. I cannot explain the theology behind, the difference between the Lutherans and the Augsburg Confession, or the Anabaptists, or what would become Anglicanism, or Methodists, and all these other, Protestant denominations that are invented during this time. I'm not a theologian. I can't go into the theological differences of these different movements. I'm sure you can find someone else on YouTube. On YouTube to explain all that. Here's another institution. Again, I love learning about these institutions. This is the Portuguese captaincies of Brazil, and so Brazil will be divided by John III into 15 hereditary captaincies, which is like 15 states or 15 different colonies of Portuguese Brazil. So that's an institution in itself. And then the first act of supremacy, this is Henry VIII's attempt to establish what would, under Elizabeth I, become the Church of England. It's not really the Anglican Church at this point. It would be overridden by Mary I when she becomes queen, and then reestablished by Elizabeth I. And I'll go into that later, this section and the next section. And so this is the first act of supremacy, declaring that he is the head of the Church of England, and that the Church of England will no longer be connected to the Catholic Church of Rome. And so the English are now establishing their own national religion, their own state religion, as opposed to just being a Catholic puppet of the Pope or the Holy Roman Emperor, like Charles I. And this is not, made easier for Charles I, given that Henry VIII divorced his relative. I think it was his aunt, that which was Catherine of Aragon. And so the Spanish are not only enemies politically with the divorce of Catherine, but are now enemies religiously, now that England is no longer a Catholic country. And so this will begin a very important process in England called the Dissolution of the Monasteries, and that will have a major impact on the relationship between the Church of England and also the Catholic Church as well. And so you have the Viceroyalty of New Spain established. This is yet another institution that is established. This is to consolidate the encomiendas, the conquistadors, which would become the encomiendas or encomienderos, as they will be known, and establishing a more centralized government over New Spain, given just how much money New Spain was bringing to the crown. The crown wanted to centralize power to secure it. And is again during the same time. Again, all this history is happening at the same time, and so this is when Henry ordered a nationwide valuation of churches, but based on wealth, and so how much money the church is bringing in from their, I guess, clergy and from I forget the word for the people who go to church but aren't members of the clergy, who have to pay their tithes to the church. And so not only does the Church of England under Henry VIII now own all the churches that were once Catholic, Henry will now be doing a valuation in preparation for the dissolution of the monasteries. You have Thomas More. Again, he's a guy who I brought up at the start of this section, who wrote Utopia, and he will go against Henry VIII in his attempt to establish the Church of England, because he is loyal to the Catholic Church, and Henry VIII will have him executed. And so after his execution, Thomas More will actually become a saint. So Saint Thomas More, a Catholic saint, for his martyrdom, defending the Catholic Church from Henry VIII. Now you have the first act of dissolution after the evaluation of the churches. The lesser monasteries, which are the poorer churches, are to be abolished, and the property of the church and the surrounding land around it, which is common land, will be enclosed and then sold to aristocrats, to the lords of parliament mostly, in order for the king to make money. And so this is part of a broader enclosure movement, which is a very important movement to understand why England will become the first industrial power, and why the colonists of the English colonies are very different from the French colonists or the Spanish colonists. And I'll go into more details tomorrow in the next chapter 2, when we cover the reign of James I and the establishment of Jamestown, because there are some things going on in England regarding the enclosure movement, which has an impact on the types of people, the types of colonists who will go to the New World for the English. And so I'll talk more about that in the next chapter tomorrow. You have John Calvin. He publishes the Institutes of the Christian Religion. So if you know anything about Calvinism, which I really cannot explain the theology behind Calvinism. I'm not a theologian. I'm not going to try to do it. I'm sure you can find someone else to do it. But this is when John Calvin and Calvinism starts to become very popular during the Protestant Reformation. Oh, excuse me. Let's see. Sorry, we're almost an hour and 30 minutes in, and we're only halfway done with this live stream. So we have a lot more to talk about. Let's try to speed this up a little bit, maybe. We'll see. We have Henry VIII. He executes Anne Boleyn. That's his second wife, on charges of adultery, incest, and treason. And he will almost immediately marry his third wife, which is a political marriage. And Henry VIII will not really love Jane Seymour. and he will divorce her, but not after she bears him a son, which is Edward the Sixth. So Anne Boleyn will be a second wife. Jane Seymour is a third wife, and now Henry VIII has a male heir, just one male heir. That is Edward the Sixth. It is during this time, during the dissolution of the lesser monasteries, before the dissolution of the greater monasteries, that you have the Pilgrimage of Grace. This begins in Lincolnshire and will spread wide with tens of thousands of participants, demanding the restoration of the monasteries. This is not just a religious thing. Many people in England live on common land or public land, and the church, the monasteries, were really the central cornerstone of these communities, of these communal communities. And with the dissolution of the monasteries and the enclosure of the land that will then be sold to the lords, that land is no longer available for the people. And so the people will rise up, at first in protest, like the Pilgrimage of Grace, in order to try to convince the monarch to restore not just the monasteries, but the public land surrounding the monasteries for the people to live on. And so you have a religious aspect to it, but also a social and economic aspect to it as well. And again, I cannot understate how important the Enclosure movement is for getting England to become the industrial powerhouse of the world, to start the Industrial Revolution, but also the Enclosure movement will have a major impact on the types of people, the types of colonists who will settle the New World. And I'll go into more details tomorrow, again, when I cover James the First. This is a leader of the Pilgrimage of Grace. He gets executed by Henry VIII. Jane Seymour dies. I got that confused. Jane Seymour was not divorced. She died of natural causes after childbirth. Birthing, I believe it was Elizabeth I. So now Henry VIII has 3 legitimate children. Mary the First from his first wife, and that's Henry VI is the third wife. I'm trying to get all these marriages in order, even on a timeline, is kind of confusing. You have another audiencia being established, this time for Panama. Again, yet another institution for the Spanish to colonize the New World with. And then you have the excommunication of Henry VIII. You have a expedition, this time on the other side of the Americas, exploring what would become California. You have the second act of dissolution, which is the act for the dissolution of the greater monasteries, where Henry VIII dissolves the monasteries that were making a lot of money, because now he wants to have even more money by just selling the land that the monasteries were on to the lords, which again contributes to the Enclosure movement. Very important development in England. Here's a famous De Soto expedition. This is now the Spanish exploring deeper into North America. And again, this is 100 years before the English, hundreds of years before the English will arrive in these parts of North America. This is the marriage of Anna Cleves, the fourth wife, to Henry VIII. And this will anger Charles I of Spain, who wanted Henry to marry Mary of Bourbon of the French dynasty. Here's another famous expedition, the Coronado expedition. This goes deep into the Southwest, Kansas, Colorado, Oklahoma, New Mexico, Arizona, some parts of Mexican California, Baja California, and northern Mexico. Here's the Dominican friar that I mentioned in the previous section, who is a mentor to Bartolome de las Casas. He gets murdered by other conquistadors, his opposition, since he was opposed to the maltreatment of Native Americans by the conquistadors. Henry VIII annuls or divorces his fourth wife, and because of how much of a failure these wives have been, Thomas Cromwell, who is an advisor to Henry VIII, he gets executed. And then he marries his fifth wife, Catherine Howard. Yeah, I'm trying to keep this all organized, even on a timeline, is kind of confusing. Then you have a Valdivia departs from Peru to conquer Chile. So now you have the conquest of modern-day Chile, which is just south of where the Aztecs were in Peru. So you got a more information about the conquest of Chile. Let's see, Calvin returns to Geneva. Again, this is part of the Protestant Reformation, and now the Calvinists are becoming much more popular. The Viceroyalty of Peru is established. The fifth wife of Henry VIII is executed for adultery, which is hypocritical for Henry VIII to do. A Cabrillo expedition along the Pacific coast, which will be exploring more of the California coast. Then you have the new laws, the Laws Nuevas of the Indies, passed by Charles I to reform the encomienda system. So the conquistadors, the term conquistador just means conqueror. And so once a place is conquered, it would be commissioned out, which is the encomienda, and the encomienda was hereditary. And so by this time, you have the children, and sometimes grandchildren, of the original conquistadors, the first conquerors, who are now inheriting those conquests through the encomienda. Well, now, Charles I wants to reform the encomienda to remove the hereditary nature of it. And a few encomienderos, which is the noun for an encomienda person, a person who has been given the encomienda, which simply means commission, and they will revolt against the Spanish crown. So these laws, these restrictions and reforms by the royal monarchy will lead to a rebellion in the colonies. Sound familiar? And so, the idea of the colonists being loyal to the mother country is very rare to happen. The type of person who would leave their country to go and conquer new lands is not really the type of person who will be loyal to that country that they left a lot of the time. And this is an example of that. And so this is, we have the full primary source document, so you can read the laws yourself. And this will eventually lead to the Great Encomiendero Rebellion, which happens at the start of the next year. And so you have the Audiencia of Lima, modern-day Peru, is established. Then you have the final sixth wife of Henry VIII, Catherine Parr. She marries Henry VIII, and she will outlive Henry VIII. Audiencia of Guatemala, that's where the mines were, is now established. And now you have the Great Encomienderos Rebellion, where a few encomienderos, people who had the encomienda, the commission, are now rebelling against the new laws that were created, which removed their hereditary status. And so this rebellion will convince Charles I to keep inheritance as part of the encomienda system, but the individuals who rebelled will be executed and killed in battle. Again, the conquest of the Mayans, or not the Mayans, the Chileans, is still going on at this time. Like I said, during the Great Encomienderos Rebellion, Charles I will rescind the inheritance ban as part of the new laws of the Indies. You have the Council of Trent, which is a Catholic Church convention in order to address the Protestant challenges. This will help establish or define Catholic doctrine during the Counter-Reformation. And so this is more of the Catholics being organized to counter the Reformation. Next we have, let's see, Gonzalo Pizarro, which I believe is a relative to the Pizarro who conquered the Inca. So it's not the same Pizarro. And he is one of the rebel encomienderos, and he gets defeated by the viceroy of Nunes Vela. The viceroy is also killed. And then, let's see. Again, I'm not going to try to say that name. This is part of the Counter-Reformation that becomes militaristic and violent. And Charles I, which is Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire, is the one in charge of defending the Catholic faith against the militarism of the Protestant Reformation. Henry VII finally dies and is replaced by Edward VI. Edward VI will pass the 1547 Vagrancy Act, which will punish vagabonds. And a vagabond is someone who doesn't have a job, is broke, and isn't a lord. And so they're just, basically homeless and jobless. And he will also provide some relief to the poor and impotent persons. But again, the dissolution of the monasteries, which also enclosed common land and disorganized the relief effort for the poor. Now vagabonds are becoming a problem, and you're going to have these laws that will punish vagabonds. Again, this is very important. The Enclosure movement, the dissolution of the monasteries, and more of these restrictions, and the consolidation of English authority of the crown and the aristocrats becomes crucially important for the English establishment of colonies in the New World. If you look at the types of people who leave England to live in the New World, they're people who are impacted greatly by the dissolution of the monasteries, by the wider Enclosure movement. And so you wonder why the people, the English colonists especially, are so communal and anti-aristocratic. It's because they're the same kind of people who were negatively impacted by the aristocracy in England, by the king, by the lords. And so when they're kicked out of their own common, communal land in England, and their religion is being disrespected with the dissolution of the monasteries, they are going to leave England, citing persecution, and move to the New World. And these are the kinds of colonists who settle the English colonies, who will become our founding fathers, who were very skeptical of lords and monarchs and religious establishments. And so, like the Church of England. And so, it's this history. The reason why this history is important during this time period is because it explains, once you study it, it explains the cause and effect that will lead to the founding of America, which is the whole point of this of teaching the colonial era, is to really, for at least for us Americans, is to teach the founding of our country primarily. There's other reasons, of course, but the primary reason is to understand how and why our country was founded. It just didn't happen overnight. It didn't happen on a whim. It happened through centuries of social and economic and religious development that, it goes back even before this time period, before the colonial era. But we start at the start of the colonial era, which is with Christopher Columbus in 1492, simply because we have better primary source documents. The further back you go, like if you go back 1,000 years more, the primary sources become more scarce and more unreliable. And so 1490s is a decent time period to start if you're relying heavily on primary sources, because the printing press was invented just a couple decades before, in the early 1450s. And so documents, you have many copies of these documents which are able to survive. If the original copy is somehow lost to history, you will most likely have a printed copy of it. And so texts are much more reliable during this time period and following this time period. Let's see, Audiencia, another Audiencia, again, a very important institution. And then the final battle of the Great Encomienderos Rebellion. This is when Pizarro's forces is crushed, and I believe Pizarro was killed during this battle. This is the Augsburg Interim, which is a settlement, like a peace settlement. Again, I'm not going to try and go into the theology of the Protestant Reformation and like all these different Protestant denominations and what they believed in. I'm sure there are other people on YouTube that you can find to learn about that. I'm just including it in the timeline so that people can know what is going on while all this other history is going on. This is the Governor General, yet another institution of Brazil, and this is to create one general to regulate all of the colonies of Brazil, the captaincies of Brazil, into a single royal governor, as opposed to just having semi-autonomous colonies all over modern-day Brazil. In England, during the reign of Edward VI, you have Kett's Rebellion, which is it started out as a local protest against the Enclosure. Again, the Enclosure movement is very important. And he was a landowner who had his land enclosed, or who participated in land enclosure himself, but then decided to side with the rebel. And at its peak, there was around 12,000 to 16,000 rebels. Royal forces were sent and quelled the rebellion at Dussindale, and the rebels demanded 29 articles, which included the end to illegal enclosures and the restoration of common rights, which put limits on renting. and then removal of corrupt local officials. So some reform in England, but the underlying problem of the Enclosure movement is still going on. You have the Audiencia of Santa Fe, which is now the southwest of the United States, which is the northwest of the Spanish colonies at that time. Oh, I'm sorry. This is Santa Fe in South America. So this is the southeast of the Spanish colonies. I'm thinking of a different Santa Fe. Robert Kett of Kett's Rebellion is executed in December 7th of 1549. Now, during this time, because of the Encomenderos Rebellion and because of a number of religious debates going on in Spain about the treatment of Native Americans, and maybe also because of the Augsburg Interim, which is a peace settlement. Maybe Charles the First of Spain was in like a peaceful mood, and he makes this royal order to suspend the conquests of the New World. And so all conquests are suspended until a debate happens. And that debate will be known as the Valladolid debate. And it's a formal debate, a formal argument between two people, Bartolomé de las Casas and Guinness des Sepulveda. I'm sorry for that, for mispronouncing that. And this debate was trying to figure out whether or not it's justified how the Spanish were treating the Native Americans. Was that justified? Was the conquests justified? And Bartolomé de las Casas, although he argues that the conquests are justified, the treatment of the natives are not justified. And he cites, the Bible and makes a religious argument for why the Spanish need to treat the Native Americans kindly. The other guy, who's also a priest, they're both friars. They both will use religious arguments. Bartolomé de las Casas will argue for more humanitarian side of things, while Sepulveda will argue that, hey, there's a lot of gnarly things in the Bible, and he will use the natural slavery argument, which goes back to like Aristotle, who said that some people are naturally slaves and need to be governed by force and not be considered equals. And so, although the debate itself was inconclusive as to who won the debate, in effect, Sepulveda won because the colonization whole program will resume, and the treatment of Native Americans, although it slightly gets better, is not really going to be enforced by the king. So, although the debate is inconclusive, Sepulveda, by default, wins because the Spanish will continue to abuse Native Americans and colonists, not just the natives, but also the Spanish colonists as well, will start to be abused by their own Spanish overlords. And then this is, let's see, a town founded by Pedro de Valdivia. Let's see what's next. Council of Trent, the second period. And again, I am not really someone who can explain the theology of this. But I know the Council of Trent, there was 3 of them during this time period, and they were like conferences for the Catholic Church to figure out how they're going to organize the Counter-Reformation and restore the Catholic authority in what's now the Protestant parts of Europe. Here's a very important primary source document. This is a brief account of the destruction of the Indies written by Bartolome de las Casas, and you can read the document if you click on this link here. We try to republish all of the primary source documents on our website, just so we have a copy of everything, and so that it's easier for people to find the full text of these documents. Edward the Sixth. Excuse me. Edward the Sixth. He is King of England. He's a son of Henry VIII. He will issue the device for the succession. Although Edward the Sixth is young, I mean, this is kind of prophetic because he dies shortly after. In fact, that's the next event on the timeline. And he will name Lady Jane Grey as his heir, which bypasses his half-sister, Mary, and his other half-sister, Elizabeth, primarily for religious reasons, to keep England Protestant, since Mary the First was Catholic, and the Catholics, the English didn't want the Catholics to come back. Shortly after Edward VI dies, he's only 15 when he dies, and his death leads to a succession crisis. So I think it's a distant cousin named Lady Jane Grey will become queen. However, Mary the First will march on London and depose Lady Jane Grey and restore Catholic rule to England. Valdivia is executed by Native Americans. This is all the way in southern Chile. Then you have Wyatt's Rebellion. This is an armed uprising led by Thomas Wyatt. In opposition to Mary the First, they don't want to have the Catholics over them, and this rebellion fails. And because of the rebellion, Lady Jane Grey is executed by Mary the First. And also because of the rebellion, Mary the First fears that Elizabeth the First, her half sister, will depose her, and so Elizabeth the First is imprisoned in the Tower of London. Mary the First will marry the son of King Charles the First, which is Philip. I think this is Philip the First. No, Philip the Second. But their marriage will not be a happy one. After years of fighting during the Protestant Reformation and Counter-Reformation, you have the Peace of Augsburg, which legalizes Lutheranism in the Holy Roman Empire under the principle of Curius Regio, Eius Religio, which means that whoever is the monarch of, or the prince of a principality, whatever their religion is, that's the religion of the state. Charles I, this guy here, he is old. He just went through the Protestant Reformation and the conquest of the Americas, and he decides to abdicate the Spanish throne, and so his son, Philip II, becomes King of Spain. Now, Charles I is still Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire, at least for a couple more years. Here is a friar, Franciscan friar, and he will create a very important work of history and sociology and geography of the New World. He writes about all the different types of peoples, what their religion is, and so before this before this guy writes this book, the Spanish are not really all that interested in learning about, and certainly not respecting, the various religions and cultures of Native Americans. This guy will write about it, and his book will actually be banned alongside The Prince by Machiavelli by the Catholic Church. And so, that happens. But this is the first attempt of someone to write a very large work, and I'll show you a link to it later. A very large work explaining the geography, the life, the animals, the plants, the different peoples and the cultures and religions of the Native Americans. And of course, this is almost 60, 70 years after the start of the conquest of the Americas. Only then do the Spanish have some interest in learning about the Native Americans, as opposed to just forcing the Native Americans to adopt Catholicism and adopt Spanish customs and the Spanish language and culture and labor organization and social statuses and stuff like that. Charles I, he abdicates as Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, and it goes to Ferdinand I, which is not the same. A lot of these guys have the same or similar names. This is not Ferdinand of Spain. That's Ferdinand II of Spain, of Aragon, not this guy, Ferdinand I of the Holy Roman Empire. And now, finally, Charles I dies September 21st, 1558, and just a little while afterwards, Mary I dies in England. And so the death of Charles I and Mary I will end the reign of the Spanish, being the number one perspective of our compendium, as in the next section, which begins with the Elizabethan Age, and this is the entire Elizabethan Age. Now we have the English perspective. So these two sections are mostly the Spanish perspective when it comes to the colonization of the New World, and now you have the English perspective, which begins with Elizabeth I. And so Elizabeth I becomes the monarch of England, the Queen of England, on November 17th, 1558. She almost immediately issues the Second Act of Supremacy. This will establish the modern-day Anglican Church. So, as we understand it, this is the Anglican Church, as opposed to what her father, Henry VIII, tried to establish decades prior. Remember what I said about the prince being banned by the Catholic Church? Well, this is the document from, or the order from the Catholic Church under Pope Paul IV to prohibit the publication of works on a certain list. And the prince is one of the very first works that is banned by the Catholic Church during this Counter-Reformation. The Audiencia of Caracas is established in modern-day Bolivia. The French Huguenots are they settle in Florida. The French Huguenots, or Huguenots, however you're supposed to say it. Again, the French language, for some reason, half the language is silent. And these are Protestants from France. And they're being persecuted, and so they leave France. Sound familiar? They leave France and go to the New World. They settle in Florida, and modern-day Florida. And this will become, this is a very short-lived colony, but it will motivate the Spanish to start to build fortifications like St. Augustine, which will be coming up shortly on this timeline. You have the Third Council of Trent. Again, the Council of Trent were conferences for the Catholic Church to try to organize the Counter-Reformation. And this one, I think they discussed something about the books that were being banned by the Catholic Church. Now you have the first voyage under Queen Elizabeth I. This is Sir John Hawkins. This is his first voyage in 1562 to 1563. And he is the first of many privateers under Elizabeth I who will be known as the Sea Dogs. And so the Sea Dogs are British privateers under the Elizabeth I's reign who are not only exploring the New World, they're also there to steal and plunder the Spanish treasure ships. So the Spanish colonial extraction machine is in full force, and a bunch of treasure ships are going back to Spain, and now the English want to steal that treasure. And so this naval culture of piracy essentially is birthed during this time period, where you have during the Elizabethan age, and some of these guys will, the privateers, will eventually become the Buccaneers, and then the Buccaneers will be a generation or two before the golden age of piracy, which will happen much later. That's chapter 3 of the compendium, so I'll be talking about that in 2 days from now. Maximilian II becomes the Holy Roman Emperor, and he will have some influence when it comes to the Counter-Reformation, especially with dealing with what's going on in France with the French wars for religion and the Huguenots, for example. Sir John Hawkins, he has a second voyage in 1564 to 1565. This is when St. Augustine is established in 1565. And again, this is established to expel the French Huguenots who settled in Florida. So the Spanish are now setting up these forts all over the Spanish colonies in order to better secure themselves from other European powers. It's not only to, it can protect from the Native Americans, but it's mostly just to expel the other European powers that are now starting to get more interested in creating colonies of their own in the New World, like the French and the English and the Dutch. John Hawkins' third voyage. Here is during John Hawkins' third voyage, you have this important battle, which was a Spanish victory, a setback for the English. Pope Pius V issues the Regnans Excelsis, which is the excommunication of Queen Elizabeth I as a heretic for the Supremacy Act. Henry Morgan, he's another sea dog. He has an expedition to Panama. You have the Holy Office, which is the Mexican Inquisition, formally installed. Yet another institution. Again, I love learning about these institutions throughout the colonies, especially the Spanish ones, which will have the greatest influence on not only the Spanish colonies, which will become Central and South America, but also English colonies. When the English start to settle, they're going to try to copy what the Spanish did. Here's Sir Francis Drake's first expedition in 1572 to 1573. Yet another sea dog under, which again, the sea dogs are privateers under Elizabeth I. And again, their main goal is to target treasure ships of the Spanish treasure ships and just plunder as much money as possible, and the British become filthy rich doing this. Here's a part of Francis Drake's expedition. This is the marriage of Henry III of Navarre and Margaret of Valois. This is between the Protestant and the Catholic, which is to preserve the religious peace in France during a very heightened, very high tension time. And although this was meant to preserve peace, peace will disappear very quickly with what happens very soon after this. You have the failed assassination of Admiral de Coligny, and this will lead into Saint Bartholomew's Day Massacre, which is a very violent anti-Protestant, anti-Huguenot event where many Huguenots, which are French Protestants, die over course of a day or two. And so this does not secure peace between the Protestants and the Catholics, as people hoped at that time. Here's Francis Drake. He's still having his raid. Laws and ordinances for the discovery, new settlement, and pacification of the Indies. And so this is now a law similar to the new laws back in 1542. These laws in 1573 change how the Spanish will be establishing new colonies and creating new settlements. Council of the Indies will ban native narratives. So, Council of the Indies, that was one of the institutions that I talked about before, and this council will ban any native-centric narratives, which I mentioned there was this book being written talking about native culture and religion and geography, and that book will actually be banned, and that's this book right here, the Historia General de las Casas de Nueva España. And so this book is an ethnographic study of mostly the Aztec society, religion, language, and daily life, based on indigenous testimony, and it's written by the guy that I talked about in the last section who was commissioned to write this book. And of course, right as he finishes writing the book, this guy, Bernardino de Sahagún, is the guy who wrote this book. And of course, right as he finishes, it gets banned right away. So, bad luck. Frobisher is a English explorer. He will explore North America, trying to find a Northwest Passage into Asia. He does not find it. I actually feel bad for him because a lot of his voyages are complete failures. And so now you have a new Holy Roman Emperor, Rudolph II. This is Frobisher's second voyage. He brings back 200 tons of what he believed was gold, and it turns out it was pyrite, which is fool's gold, which is completely, it's not completely useless. There is a use to it, but it's not gold. And so it's kind of funny how how this guy, complete failure expeditions, and he brings back just a butt ton, 200 tons of pyrite, which is a crazy amount to bring on boats, on wooden boats at the time, back to England. You have the Royal Credula, which just means Royal Order of 1577, which is issued by King Philip II, ordering that these manuscripts that were written, be seized and confiscated and then hidden away in archive, and it wouldn't be for centuries that this book would be published later. And so there's an online archive that you can look through in Florence, Italy. I don't know why it's in Italy. It should be in Spain. Really should be in modern day Mexico. That's where it should be kept, since it's about Aztec culture and religion. So that's my thoughts on that. And you have Sir Francis Drake's Circumnavigation of the World, and this is similar to Magellan's Circumnavigation. They actually follow a very similar path for most of it, and then Sir Francis actually survives, and he brings back over $500 million in today's money worth of treasure back to England. And so, upwards of $650 million. That's an insane amount of money on a single voyage back to England. It's the most profitable privateering voyage in English history. So, very, very wealthy. It made Sir Francis Drake very wealthy, and Elizabeth I very wealthy, and it encouraged a lot more English involvement into the New World. Of course, Frobisher, his third voyage, failed to establish a settlement, and he turned with more ore like pyrite. You have the letters patent to Sir Humphrey Gilbert, and this is the first time that the English will give permission to a actual settler to establish a colony. You had Henry VII with John Cabot, but that was mostly just to claim land that didn't really lead to any settlements being established. And so this will eventually lead to the Roanoke colony that will happen in about a decade from this document. The Relationes Geographicas, which is like an audit of, or like a survey of the territories controlled by the Spanish in America. And this is just a survey what the colonies look like, how are they divided and organized, what were the borders demarcating one colony from another. And so this would be very important to strengthen imperial administration and improve economic exploitation. Also, keeping a record, like an audit, of the kinds of wealth that each colony was providing the Spanish. Following the death of Portugal's King Henry, who had no heirs, multiple claimants fought for the throne in what was known as the Portuguese succession crisis of 1580. And the succession crisis will conclude with Philip II of Spain being crowned Philip I of Portugal. So now this establishes the Iberian Union. So now Spain and Portugal are one political entity. They're still legally separate, but they're controlled by the same guy. Sir Humphrey Gilbert, he has an expedition trying to establish a colony, and he dies during this expedition. And this will, the person who will replace Sir Humphrey Gilbert is Sir Walter Raleigh. And so Queen Elizabeth will give him, Sir Walter Raleigh, the charter to establish new colonies. And the first thing that Sir Walter Raleigh does is he sends a expedition, which was led by Amadas and Barlow. And here's a video by Jeffrey the Librarian, his YouTube channel. And I highly encourage you guys to look up this YouTube channel and to follow him and to watch his videos. And so here's a video of this expedition of 1584, and they will find a place that will become the Roanoke colony. Sir Francis Drake will start his own expedition, and he'll be knighted by Elizabeth I, and then he will have the Lane expedition, which will be the one that establishes the Roanoke colony on Roanoke Island. So here you see here the establishment of, this is the actual map made by John White, who will be the first. He's a leader of this expedition. You have Ralph Lane and then John White, and this is an actual map made in 1585 by John White, and you can see this island here, that is Roanoke. The Treaty of Nonsuch is between the English and the Dutch. So the Dutch are kind of being conquered by the Spanish during this time. Like Belgium is under Spanish control, and the Dutch in the Netherlands are fighting the Spanish, and so they side with the English to fight the Spanish, because the Spanish are also, Catholics, while the Dutch and the English are Protestant. So there's a religious aspect to it. There's a political, nationalistic aspect to it. Dutch versus Spanish, and the English are supporting the Dutch. And so there's many different aspects, and this is the effective beginning of the Anglo-Spanish War. The English army lands in the Netherlands, although the English army is not very successful. The first attempt to establish Roanoke was not successful. Queen Mary of Scots will be executed. She's Catholic, and she will be executed. She's a Stuart, and the current dynasty is the Tudor dynasty, and so Elizabeth I will execute Mary, Queen of Scots, and this will worsen the relationship between the Spanish, who wanted to ally, and the French, who wanted to ally with Queen Mary for being a Catholic. And so this is another contributing factor to the Anglo-Spanish War. Francis Drake attacks the Spanish at Cadiz, and the reason why Sir Francis Drake attacks Cadiz, which is in southern Spain, is Cadiz was where King Philip II of Spain was creating and putting together his armada, and so the Spanish Armada is being formed at this point. Here's the second attempt to establish Roanoke colony, which he is somewhat more successful than the first attempt, although this attempt will also fail. And White's advisors killed by Roanoke Indians almost immediately. Very bad start to the Roanoke colony. King Philip obtains a papal authority to overthrow Elizabeth I. So Philip II now has papal authority to go to war with Elizabeth I for, being a Protestant, and also killing Mary, Queen of Scots. The colonists will meet with the Croatoan Indians, which they will ally with. Colonists raid Roanoke Indians, only to kill friendly Croatoan Indians. A misunderstanding, of course. Manteo, a Croatoan who got to visit England twice, is christened and becomes a lord in the New World. Virginia Dare is the first baby born to English parents in North America, and that is in 1587. John White, he sails back to England to try to get more aid for the English, and he won't be able to go back to Roanoke, that is, with the aid, because of the threat of the Spanish Armada. which happens in 1588. The threat of the Spanish Armada is defeated at the Battle of Gravelines. There's a bunch of battles prior to this. This is the last of the Spanish Armada battles. And this will lead to the English Counter Armada, which most people leave out. Once the Spanish Armada was dealt with, the English dispatches an expedition of their own, led by Francis Drake, against the Spanish, not just in Europe, but also in the New World. But the campaign fails and suffers heavy losses, similar, not really similar to the Spanish Armada. They lost so many ships. The English lost very little during the Battle of Gravelines, but during the English Counter Armada, the English lost a lot. They would have the Azores voyage, also known as Cumberland's Third Voyage, a series of conflicts in the Azores, which is off the coast of Western Africa and Spain in the Atlantic. This is part of the English Counter Armada offensive against the Spanish. John White finally returns after a couple of years in 1590 to Roanoke, where he sees that the colony has been abandoned and only the word Croatoan left on one of the trees. Now, Croatoan was the name of the native tribe that allied with the colonists, and so they decided to try to go and see if the English colonists went to Croatoan, to the island that the Croatoans were living on, but they either didn't land because of the weather, or they didn't find anyone. The English didn't find anyone there, so we don't know exactly what happened to the Roanoke colony. They probably mostly died. We don't know for sure. There's some reports generations later that some white or light-skinned people living with Native Americans were discovered. So maybe some of them survived and had generations of children and grandchildren. Maybe they all died and that was just a made-up story. We don't know. Again, part of the counter armada attempt or expedition of the English included the blockading of Western Cuba. Let's see, some more battles off the Portuguese coast. Newport's expedition to Hispaniola and Honduras to raid Spanish towns. Sir Walter Raleigh's Azores expedition. He comes back with the Great Carack, Madre de Dios, which is this massive, massive ship, this behemoth of a ship, and this, which is called a carack, which is it's basically a shipping cargo ship, basically, where it's huge, and it can hold a lot of material, a lot of raw material, gold, metal, stuff like that. And so Sir Walter Raleigh, he captures it and brings it back to England, and Queen Elizabeth herself made a 2,000% profit from just this one expedition, which is an insane amount of money. It's not as valuable as the circumnavigation of Sir Francis Drake, where she made $500 million in today's money. But still very, very lucrative profession for Elizabeth I. She made a lot of money from just stealing it from the Spanish. And then you have the 9 Years' War, which is a war between England and Ireland, because, of course. And it's interesting because the English will create the institution of a plantation, not in the Americas. That institution will be established to colonize Ireland, not the Americas. The concept of the plantation would be brought over to the Americas, but it was invented by the English to colonize Ireland, which is interesting. And again, it's an institutional thing, and I love learning about institutions. James Lancaster, he has his own expedition. Here's Sir Walter Raleigh's El Dorado expedition. Preston Summers expedition. I got a bunch of these expeditions on here. And then Drake Hawkins' disastrous final voyage, where Sir John Hawkins, he's one of the first sea dogs, and Sir Francis Drake, one of the most successful sea dogs. Both of these men die in the same voyage in 1595 and then 1596, respectively. And then here's the Essex Raleigh expedition. And then the Onate expedition to the southwest. So the Spanish are still exploring and still creating more settlements, although a lot of the success of the early years of the conquest are starting to be hampered by geography. So you have the Sierra Madre, you have the Great Basin out west, you have the Rocky Mountains, you have all these geographical features that stop the Spanish from successfully colonizing everything north of the Rio Grande. And then south, you have the Portuguese, the Amazons of the Andes Mountains, which is another geographical feature of the environment, which is slowing down the Spanish conquests. So the Spanish, they were really just lucky. Cortez was just really lucky to find Mexico, find the Aztecs, and be able to conquer them and bring all that wealth to Spain. And here is George Clifford's expedition. Philip II, King of Spain, he dies, and his son Philip III becomes king. Parker's expedition, William Parker, an English privateer. He will capture Portobello, which is a very important city port in Panama. Very famous, should be more famous to historians of this time period. And that city, that port city will become a very important target for the English and the Spanish and the French and the Dutch for many years during the colonial era. And then finally we get to Queen Elizabeth I dying. Yes, she's dead, and this chapter ends with her death. Ugh. It has been 2.5 hours of me explaining, just summarizing what we have on the compendium for the first chapter. So just a reiteration. This is the first chapter of the colonial era, the first chapter of the entire compendium, out of 3 chapters for the colonial era and out of 26 chapters for the entire compendium. And this chapter is called La Conquista from 1492 to 1603. And this chapter is divided into 3 sections. The first section is called Conquistadors of the Caribbean, and it focuses on the Spanish conquest of the Caribbean from 1492 to 1516. The next section is called the Tierra Firme, which is a Spanish term for the American mainland, and this is from 1516 to 1558 and covers the reign of Charles I of Spain. So much stuff was happening during this time. The Protestant Reformation and the start of the Counter-Reformation were happening. The various conquests of the largest Native American empires, the Aztecs, the Inca, the Maya, that happens at this time. The creation of colonial institutions, the encomienda, the Audiencia, the viceroyalties, the captaincies of Portugal. All these institutions are created during this time, during this section, all within the reign of Charles I of Spain. You have the attempt to establish the Anglican Church by Henry VIII. You have the dissolution of the monasteries, the expansion of the Enclosure movement, the reign of Edward VI, Lady Jane Grey, and Mary I, and all this going on, all in this one section. And then you have the Elizabethan Age, the third and final section of this chapter, which covers the reign of Elizabeth. So this pivots from the Spanish perspective in the previous two sections to the English perspective as the English start to become the dominant player of the colonies. Not yet fully dominant, but after the defeat of the Spanish Armada, the Spanish Navy is completely devastated and can no longer block the other European powers from setting up colonies like Roanoke, and the Spanish will be setting up, or the French will be setting up their own colonies, the Dutch will be setting up their own colonies, and so will the English at the start of the next chapter, which will begin with the reign of James I. And so during this period, you have the establishment of the Anglican Church of England with the Act of Supremacy. You have the Anglo-Spanish War. You have all the sea dogs, which are British privateers, to plunder Spanish treasure ships. You have all these voyages going on of exploration for the English. The British are making so much money just stealing from the Spanish. And that is it. That is the entire first chapter of the colonial era. And it only took me 2.5 hours just to give an overview of that. And so tomorrow, at the same time, 4:30, I will be going over chapter 2, which is called Nova Britannia, from 1603 to 1675. It is a shorter chapter when it comes to the time frame, but there are so many things happening. And so in terms of events, and especially primary source documents that we include, it's probably going to be pretty similar in, the duration of the live stream, maybe a little bit less than today. So if you missed today's live stream, please be there for tomorrow's live stream. If you have questions or comments or anything like that on our YouTube channel, please just ask the questions. I'm more than happy to engage with people and answer any questions that I can about history and about this resource, which is the compendium on our website. I have a link to the compendium in the description of the live stream, and when I re-upload the video of the live stream, then you'll have the link in the description as well. So if you were here, which I know there weren't that many people here, but if you were, then thank you for listening. And if you weren't here, then you can still join me tomorrow and for the next 25 days, because every single day I'm going to be covering a different chapter of the compendium, and we have 26 chapters. So today was just day 1, chapter 1, and so tomorrow will be day 2, chapter 2. And so I hope to see you there, and I hope you learned something new about our old history. And check out our website. We are an educational nonprofit, a 501c3, so all donations are tax deductible and go towards our charitable work, which includes compiling a resource like this, the compendium, for use by teachers, students, scholars, anyone interested in learning history, looking at primary sources in a more visually engaging and interactive way, like this interactive timeline that I have, that I created for each of the sections. This is a resource that anyone can access for free. And again, if you want to look at a primary source document that we have, there should be a read document button. And when you click that, it will take you to the full text of that document. And I'm going through and adding information on the side of each document with an image of the document if we have it, a little annotation of the document, images if we can find some of the authors, and if it's a document like this where there's a recipient, we're going to include information about them as well. For example, this is Christopher Columbus, and we're creating this as a free resource for anyone to use, teachers, students, scholars, people just wanting to learn history. You can use this resource. It is absolutely free and online. It is best viewed on desktop. Don't try to view it on mobile. I mean, you can try, but it looks much better on desktop than it does on mobile. So please check us out. Donate if you can. And if you want to learn more, or if you want to contribute a large donation, you can reach out to me at mark@tarpeia.us. Tarpeia is spelled TARPEIA.us. And my name is Mark with a K. And you can send me an email sharing your interest for donating to the charity. If it's a large donation, then I'll send you our information, like our EIN and our address for you to send that donation to. If you don't want to donate a large donation, you can just donate on our website, and we have the option for people to sponsor an era of history. And so if you want your name placed on our website for the era that you're most interested in, or if you want to support us in being able to pay archives for special use of some of their material, like images of these primary source documents, which sometimes costs us money, then you can sponsor an era and show your support and interest in us doing more research for that particular era. So thank you again for watching, if you watched, and I hope to see you in tomorrow's live stream. So thank you, and have a nice day.